March 5, 1943. Central Burma, 200 miles behind Japanese lines. Brigadier Orde Wingate stood in a bamboo thicket so dense that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, staring at a map that might as well have been blank. Around him, 3,000 British, Gurkha, and Burmese soldiers waited in silence, every man knowing they were deeper into enemy territory than any Allied force had penetrated since the catastrophic fall of Burma a year earlier. They had no tanks, no artillery, no supply lines stretching back to safety, nothing but what they carried on their backs, a few mules, and a radio link to RAF transport planes that, if everything went exactly right, would drop supplies from the sky in 4 days, if everything went exactly right. Wingate faced a choice that would either revolutionize modern warfare or become a cautionary tale about the dangers of military imagination. Behind them lay India and safety, reachable in perhaps 2 weeks of hard marching. Ahead lay the Japanese supply lines feeding their frontline armies, vulnerable, critical, and defended by an enemy that had never been defeated in jungle combat. Every military manual said you couldn't operate this deep behind enemy lines. Every expert agreed that jungle warfare favored defense, not offense. Every precedent suggested that Wingate's force would be hunted down and annihilated within days. Wingate believed all the experts were catastrophically wrong. This wasn't hubris speaking. It was calculation born from radical thinking about what actually mattered in modern war. He'd spent 18 months preparing for this moment, developing tactics that contradicted everything the British Army had learned in 200 years of imperial campaigns. He'd trained his men to move at night through jungle so thick you couldn't see 5 feet ahead. He'd abolished supply lines in favor of aerial resupply, a concept never tested at this scale. He'd rejected the defensive mentality that had led to unbroken Japanese victories, embracing instead a philosophy of aggressive penetration deep into enemy rear areas. Now came the test. Within the next 6 hours, Wingate would lead the first long-range penetration operation in military history, pioneering techniques that would reshape jungle warfare for the next 3 decades. His success would inspire the creation of modern special forces units worldwide. His methods would be studied from Vietnam to modern counterinsurgency campaigns. Military historians would call it the most audacious operation of the Second World War. And yet somehow, inexplicably, Orde Wingate remains largely forgotten outside military circles. Ask 100 people to name British generals from World War II, and you'll hear Montgomery, maybe Alexander or Slim. Wingate, the man who invented modern jungle warfare, who commanded Churchill's personal admiration, who revolutionized how armies think about operating behind enemy lines, has faded from popular memory despite changing warfare forever. By the end of this story, you'll understand why his achievements matter more than most of the celebrated victories that overshadow them, and why the techniques developed in Burma's jungles in 1943 still influence how elite forces operate today. You'll see how one iconoclastic officer, rejected by the military establishment and recovering from a suicide attempt just 2 years earlier, created a new form of warfare under the most desperate circumstances imaginable. But we can't just jump straight to the jungle. Without understanding the context, without seeing how catastrophically the Allies were losing in Southeast Asia, how thoroughly the myth of Japanese invincibility had paralyzed British thinking, and why traditional approaches had failed so completely, you can't grasp why Wingate's innovation mattered, or why it seemed so impossible. Let me take you back to where this story really begins. Not in the Burmese jungle, but in the wreckage of British imperial confidence and the desperate search for any way to strike back at an enemy that seemed unbeatable. The Japanese conquest of Southeast Asia in 1941-1942 represented one of the most complete military humiliations in British history. Consider what happened in just 5 months. December 8, 1941. Japan attacked British Malaya with approximately 36,000 troops against a defending force of 88,000 British, Indian, and Australian soldiers. Military doctrine said the attackers needed a 3-to-1 advantage to succeed. The Japanese were outnumbered more than 2-to-1. They won anyway. Not just won, They shattered Allied forces in a campaign that became a textbook example of operational brilliance. While British commanders expected Japanese forces to advance slowly down Malaya's road network, Japanese troops moved through supposedly impassable jungle, constantly appearing on British flanks and rear. While British doctrine emphasized holding defensive positions, Japanese forces bypassed strong points, captured supply dumps, and kept Allied forces perpetually off balance. The campaign lasted 70 days. It should have taken 6 months if it succeeded at all. February 15, 1942. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, supposedly impregnable, defended by 85,000 troops, surrendered to a Japanese force of 36,000 that was nearly out of ammunition. Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. He wasn't exaggerating. Britain lost 138,000 troops killed, wounded, or captured in Malaya and Singapore. The Japanese lost 9,024. But the disaster was just beginning. The Burma campaign that followed made the Malayan defeat look competent by comparison. In March 1942, Japanese forces invaded Burma with approximately 35,000 troops. Defending Burma were roughly 42,000 British, Indian, and Burmese soldiers, reinforced by Chinese divisions. The result was what military historians politely call a confused withdrawal, and what participants simply called a rout. By May 1942, British forces had retreated 1,000 miles, the longest retreat in British military history, abandoning Burma completely and fleeing into India. They lost approximately 13,463 casualties plus thousands more to disease. More importantly, they lost all credibility. The Japanese had conquered an area larger than France and Germany combined in less than 6 months, suffering relatively light casualties while crushing forces that outnumbered them. Think about what this meant for Allied strategy in 1942. In Europe, Soviet forces were locked in a desperate struggle with Germany. In the Pacific, American forces were only beginning to shift from defensive to offensive operations after Midway. In Southeast Asia, Japan controlled everything from Burma to the Philippines, from Malaya to the Dutch East Indies. China, fighting Japan since 1937, was isolated except for supply routes through Burma, routes the Japanese had just cut. And beyond the strategic disaster lay something more dangerous: psychological paralysis. The myth of Japanese invincibility wasn't just propaganda. Allied soldiers genuinely believed that Japanese forces were unbeatable in jungle warfare. Every engagement had reinforced this belief. Japanese troops moved faster, attacked more aggressively, outflanked defensive positions, and seemed comfortable in terrain that terrified British and Indian soldiers. British commanders, trained in European warfare and colonial policing, had no answer. The standard response to Japanese infiltration was to fall back and form a new defensive line, which Japanese forces would promptly outflank again. The numbers tell the story of this psychological collapse. In 1942 Burma campaign, British forces typically outnumbered Japanese forces in individual engagements, sometimes significantly. But when Japanese troops appeared on their flanks or rear, British commanders ordered withdrawals almost automatically. The assumption that Japanese forces were larger and more capable than they actually were became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Retreat became the default response to contact. By mid-1942, morale in British forces in India was catastrophic. Malaria hospitalization rates exceeded combat casualties by 10 to 1 or more. Desertion rates climbed. Units that had fought bravely in North Africa or Europe fell apart when facing Japanese forces in jungle terrain. The Indian Army, backbone of British power in Asia, showed signs of cracking under the strain of unbroken defeat. And the worst part? Nobody had any good ideas about how to fix it. Traditional British military doctrine emphasized firepower, artillery, air support, armor, none of which worked well in dense jungle. British tactics assumed supply lines connecting front-line troops to rear areas, but in jungle warfare, There were no clear front lines, and Japanese forces regularly infiltrated rear areas. British training focused on set-piece battles with defined objectives, but Japanese forces avoided set-piece battles, instead using infiltration and encirclement to force Allied withdrawals without decisive combat. The few British successes in Southeast Asia had been defensive. The defense of Imphal and Kohima in 1944 would prove that British and Indian forces could defeat Japanese attacks when fighting from prepared positions with secure supply lines. But defense didn't win wars. Defense didn't recover lost territory. Defense didn't break the myth of Japanese invincibility or restore confidence to Allied forces. What the Allies needed was offense. Successful offense, sustained offense, offensive operations that proved Japanese forces could be beaten in jungle terrain through aggressive action rather than defensive grinding. They needed new tactics specifically designed for jungle warfare. They needed to prove that Allied forces could operate behind Japanese lines, disrupting their logistics and communications. They needed to demonstrate that the jungle itself could be a weapon for Allied forces, rather than just an environment that favored Japanese tactics. They needed, in other words, everything they didn't have and nobody knew how to create. General Archibald Wavell, Commander-in-Chief India, understood the problem clearly. In August 1942, he wrote to Churchill, "The British soldier is not inferior to the Japanese soldier in physique, skill, or courage. His inferiority lies in his mind, which has been affected by unfavorable comparison with the enemy, by the failure of his leaders and his weapons, and by ignorance of how to turn the jungle from a hostile isle into a friendly element." The question was, how do you change an army's mind? How do you convince soldiers who've been beaten repeatedly that they can win? How do you develop new tactics when you're losing and have no time for careful experimentation? How do you go on offense when you barely have resources to defend? And that's exactly what terrified everyone who understood the strategic situation. The Japanese were consolidating their position in Burma, building defenses, fortifying supply lines. Every month that passed made the eventual reconquest more difficult and costly. Meanwhile, Chinese forces, depending on supplies flown over the Himalayas from India, were weakening. If China collapsed or signed a separate peace with Japan, the entire strategic situation in Asia would shift dramatically in Japan's favor. The Allies needed offensive action in Burma. They needed it soon. And they needed it to succeed, because another high-profile failure might break Allied morale completely. What they got was Orde Wingate, and nobody was quite sure if that was a solution or another disaster waiting to happen. There was one man who thought the British Army had learned exactly the wrong lessons from the Burma debacle. His name was Orde Wingate, and in the summer of 1942, when most British officers were focused on preventing another Japanese offensive into India, Wingate was designing an offensive operation that would take British forces hundreds of miles behind Japanese lines. To understand why Wingate's thinking was so radical, and why the British military establishment both needed him and distrusted him profoundly, you need to understand who he was and how he'd reached conclusions that contradicted conventional military wisdom. Orde Charles Wingate was born February 26, 1903, in Naini Tal, India, to a Plymouth Brethren missionary family. This background shaped everything about him. The Plymouth Brethren emphasized direct interpretation of Scripture, rejection of religious hierarchy, and individual spiritual commitment. They were nonconformist by conviction, suspicious of established authority, confident that truth was accessible through rigorous study rather than institutional tradition. These characteristics defined Wingate's military career. He would become notorious for rejecting doctrine when he believed careful analysis showed it was wrong. He would alienate superiors by questioning conventional wisdom publicly and harshly. He would develop intensely loyal followings among subordinates who appreciated his willingness to challenge authority on their behalf. And he would achieve remarkable successes precisely because he refused to accept that conventional wisdom was necessarily correct. But in 1942, all that lay ahead. First, Wingate needed to survive his own demons. Wingate attended the Royal Military Academy Woolwich and was commissioned into the Royal Artillery in 1923. His early career was unremarkable but showed signs of the unconventional thinking that would define him. In Sudan, in the 1930s, he became fascinated by irregular warfare, studying how small, mobile forces could achieve effects disproportionate to their size. He learned Arabic fluently. He spent months in the desert learning to navigate by stars, to move at night, to think like raiders rather than conventional soldiers. Then came Palestine. In 1936, Arab revolt broke out against British rule and Jewish immigration. Wingate, posted to Palestine as an intelligence officer, developed a novel response. Instead of static defense or punitive raids, he organized special night squads, joint British-Jewish units that used intelligence, night movement, and aggressive patrolling to preempt Arab attacks. The tactics worked brilliantly. More importantly, they demonstrated Wingate's emerging philosophy. Small, well-trained, aggressively led forces operating at night could dominate terrain that larger conventional forces could only react to. The British Army establishment hated it. Wingate's tactics worked, but they required initiative from junior officers, relied on intelligence from irregular sources, and most damningly, showed that conventional garrison tactics were inferior to his innovations. Wingate didn't help his case by saying so, loudly and repeatedly. He gained a reputation as brilliant but difficult, effective but insubordinate, capable of remarkable achievements but impossible to work with. In 1939, Wingate was essentially exiled from Palestine, his night squads disbanded, his tactics ignored. To someone of Wingate's temperament, convinced his methods were superior, frustrated by institutional resistance to innovation, this felt like betrayal. Then came Ethiopia. In 1940, Italy controlled Ethiopia and Eritrea with approximately 250,000 troops. British forces in Sudan and Kenya needed to drive the Italians out, but lacked the troops for conventional operations. Wingate, now a major, proposed an alternative: train and lead Ethiopian irregular forces in a guerrilla campaign, supporting them with a small British cadre. Use mobility and surprise rather than numbers. Operate behind Italian lines rather than attacking their front. Win Ethiopian hearts by fighting alongside them rather than for them. The Gideon Force, as Wingate called it, numbered only about 1,700 men, mostly Ethiopian irregulars, with a British corps of perhaps 70 officers and NCOs. Facing them were Italian colonial forces numbering in the tens of thousands. Conventional military analysis said Wingate's force was irrelevant at best, suicidal at worst. Wingate proved the analysis catastrophically wrong. Between January and May 1941, Gideon Force operated across western Ethiopia, attacking Italian positions, ambushing convoys, spreading alarm far beyond their actual strength. Wingate's tactics were revolutionary: never attack unless you could achieve surprise. Never defend terrain you couldn't afford to lose. Move constantly to prevent the enemy from concentrating against you. Use the enemy's own road network against them by ambushing their responses. The psychological effect was devastating. Italian commanders, unable to determine Gideon Force's actual strength, vastly overestimated it. Garrison after garrison surrendered to forces much smaller than themselves. In May 1941, Addis Ababa fell to Allied forces, with Gideon Force playing a role completely disproportionate to its size. Emperor Haile Selassie returned to his capital after 5 years of exile. Wingate emerged from Ethiopia as a colonel, having demonstrated that irregular forces operating behind enemy lines could achieve strategic effects. He'd refined tactics for small unit operations in difficult terrain. He'd proven that aggressive action by numerically inferior forces could paralyze much larger enemies through psychological effect. And he'd developed absolute confidence that conventional military wisdom about force ratios and defensive positions was often wrong. The British establishment response? They sent him to Cairo and largely ignored him. To Wingate, this was another betrayal, perhaps the one that broke something inside him. He'd proven his methods worked. He'd achieved results, and the army was filing him away rather than learning from his success. In Cairo in 1941, increasingly isolated and frustrated, Wingate's mental health deteriorated. He'd always been intense, driven, difficult. Now he became moody, erratic, depressed. In July 1941, Orde Wingate attempted suicide by stabbing himself in the neck. He survived, barely. The medical board wanted him invalided out of the service. Friends intervened to keep him in the army, assigned to meaningless staff positions where he could do no harm. By early 1942, Wingate's career seemed over. He was 39 years old, recovering from a mental breakdown with a reputation as a brilliant maverick who couldn't be trusted with responsibility. And then Burma fell. General Wavell, who'd supported Wingate in Ethiopia, was now Commander-in-Chief India, facing the disasters described earlier. Wavell needed new thinking about jungle warfare. He needed someone willing to challenge conventional wisdom about what was possible. He needed an officer who'd proven he could achieve results with irregular forces in difficult terrain. In February 1942, Wavell summoned Wingate to India with a simple question. Could the tactics that worked in Ethiopia work in Burma? Wingate's answer was yes, but only if the army was willing to completely rethink its approach to jungle warfare. What followed was the most intense period of military innovation in Wingate's career. He spent months studying the Burma campaign, interviewing survivors, analyzing why Japanese tactics succeeded. His conclusion was radical. The British Army had lost in Burma not because Japanese soldiers were superior, but because British tactics were designed for the wrong war. Here's what Wingate understood that most officers didn't. First, the jungle wasn't inherently hostile to British forces. It was hostile to British tactics. British units moved on roads because that's what doctrine emphasized. Japanese units moved through jungle, which gave them the initiative. British forces needed supply lines extending back to depots, which made them vulnerable to encirclement. Japanese forces traveled light and lived off the land, which made them mobile. British commanders worried about protecting their flanks and rear, which made them defensive. Japanese commanders accepted risk to maintain offensive momentum, which kept British forces off balance. Second, the myth of Japanese invincibility was exactly that, a myth. Japanese forces in Burma numbered roughly 35,000 in the initial invasion. They'd conquered Burma by creating the illusion of overwhelming strength through constant movement and aggressive action. British forces, unable to determine Japanese strength accurately, had overestimated their numbers and capability. The solution wasn't more defensive positions, it was operations that would force Japanese forces to respond, revealing their actual dispositions and limitations. Third, modern technology, specifically radio communication and aerial resupply, made it possible to operate deep behind enemy lines in ways that hadn't been feasible in earlier wars. A force that could be resupplied by air didn't need vulnerable supply lines stretching back hundreds of miles. A force with radio communication could coordinate operations across vast distances. A force that combined mobility, aerial resupply, and radio communication could operate where enemies didn't expect them, strike where enemies were weak, and disappear before enemies could concentrate to counterattack. Fourth, the key to jungle warfare wasn't firepower, it was mobility and surprise. Heavy weapons, artillery, vehicles, all the things British forces tried to bring into the jungle were liabilities. They slowed movement, required roads, needed constant supply. Light forces, traveling fast, attacking unexpectedly, could achieve effects that heavy forces never could. And fifth, perhaps most radical, offense was actually safer than defense in jungle warfare. British forces defending positions had been repeatedly outflanked and forced to retreat. But forces constantly moving, attacking Japanese supply lines and rear areas, would force Japanese units to defend everywhere. diluting their strength. The very act of penetrating deep behind Japanese lines would spread alarm and force Japanese commanders to allocate resources to rear area security rather than front-line operations. Put together, these insights formed a revolutionary concept: long-range penetration operations. Small, highly trained forces supplied by air, operating deep behind enemy lines for extended periods, targeting Japanese supply lines, communications, and logistics. Not guerrilla warfare, these would be regular military formations. Not raids, these would be sustained operations lasting months. Not symbolic gestures, these would be campaigns designed to achieve strategic effects. Wingate wrote it all down in an extensive proposal submitted to Wavell in May 1942. The document was extraordinary. Part tactical manual, part strategic analysis, part philosophical treatise on the nature of jungle warfare. Wingate argued that long-range penetration operations could disrupt Japanese logistics, forcing them to allocate troops to rear area security, demonstrate to Allied soldiers that Japanese forces could be beaten in jungle terrain, provide intelligence about Japanese dispositions and capabilities, support Chinese forces by disrupting Japanese communications, test new tactics for eventual large-scale offensive operations. Wavell, reading Wingate's proposal, faced a difficult decision. The concept was brilliant but unproven at this scale. Wingate himself was recovering from a suicide attempt and had a reputation for being impossible to work with. The resources required, aircraft for supply, trained troops, radio equipment, were scarce. And if the operation failed, it would be another disaster in a year already full of disasters. But Wavell also understood that doing nothing was worse than trying something radical. By June 1942, Wavell had concluded that long-range penetration operations must be attempted, not because they were guaranteed to succeed, but because the alternative was accepting strategic paralysis while Japanese forces consolidated their position in Burma. Wingate was promoted to brigadier and given authorization to form a special force. He called it the Chindits, the anglicized Burmese word for the mythical lion griffins that guarded Burmese temples. Now came the hard part, turning theory into practice. The obstacles facing Wingate in summer 1942 stacked like a ladder, reaching toward impossibility. First obstacle: troops. Wingate needed approximately 3,000 men capable of operating behind enemy lines for months. They needed to be physically fit enough to march hundreds of miles through jungle terrain, mentally resilient enough to handle isolation, constant danger, and the knowledge that if they were wounded or sick, they couldn't be evacuated. Skilled enough to navigate at night, live off minimal supplies, and win firefights against Japanese forces. And disciplined enough to maintain cohesion without the traditional support structure of rear areas, bases, and supply lines. Finding 3,000 such men in mid-1942 India was nearly impossible. British forces in India were recovering from the Burma debacle. Units were under strength, demoralized, suffering from malaria and other tropical diseases. The best formations were being held for defensive operations against potential Japanese offensives. Wavell couldn't afford to give Wingate top-quality troops. What Wingate got instead was the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade, a formation that existed mostly on paper, cobbled together from whatever units could be spared. The main battalion was the 13th King's Liverpool Regiment, which had arrived from the Middle East and had no jungle warfare experience. Also included were the 3 Gurkha Rifles, experienced but under strength, and the 2nd Burma Rifles, a unit of Burmese troops loyal to Britain but devastated by the Burma campaign. These were not elite forces. They were average soldiers who happened to be available. Most commanders would have looked at this collection of units and concluded that long-range penetration operations were impossible. Wingate looked at them and designed a training program. Second obstacle: time. It was June 1942. If operations were to begin before monsoon season ended, Wingate had roughly 6 months to train his force from scratch. Military doctrine suggested that preparing troops for behind-the-lines operations required a year minimum. Wingate had half that, and he needed to not just train soldiers, but to fundamentally change how they thought about jungle warfare. Third obstacle: equipment and logistics. Long-range penetration operations required radios capable of communicating hundreds of miles, RAF transport aircraft allocated specifically for supply drops, mules trained to move quietly at night, specialized weapons, light, reliable, easy to maintain, medical supplies, but no way to evacuate serious casualties, navigation equipment for jungle terrain with few landmarks, detailed maps of Burma. Many areas had never been accurately mapped. The British Indian Army had almost none of this. Radios were scarce and often unreliable. Transport aircraft were desperately needed for operations over the Himalayas to supply China. Mules were available but not trained for jungle operations. Medical supplies were limited. Maps of interior Burma were often inaccurate or missing entirely. Fourth obstacle: tactics. Everything Wingate was proposing was new. There were no tactical manuals for long-range penetration operations, no doctrine for aerial resupply of forces behind enemy lines, no established procedures for coordinating columns operating independently across hundreds of miles, no proven methods for fighting as light infantry deep in enemy territory. Wingate would have to invent all of this while simultaneously training his force. Fifth obstacle: support structure. Long-range penetration operations required cooperation from multiple organizations that had their own priorities. RAF would need to dedicate aircraft to supply drops, diverting them from other missions. Intelligence services would need to provide detailed information about Japanese dispositions. Chinese forces would need to coordinate operations to take advantage of Japanese responses. Indian Army headquarters would need to protect Wingate's force from being diverted to other operations. Getting this cooperation required political skills, precisely the skills Wingate lacked. He was notorious for alienating superiors, dismissing conventional officers, and making demands rather than requests. Sixth obstacle: secrecy. If Japanese intelligence learned about long-range penetration preparations, they could position forces to ambush Wingate's columns as they crossed into Burma. Yet Wingate needed to conduct large-scale training exercises, gather supplies, and brief numerous officers, all activities difficult to hide. Most commanders thought it was impossible to overcome all these obstacles in 6 months. Wingate didn't disagree about the difficulty. He simply refused to accept that difficulty meant impossibility. He was risking his reputation, his career, everything on the belief that rigorous training and innovative tactics could transform average soldiers into a force capable of revolutionary operations. This was an enormous gamble. If Wingate's force failed, it wouldn't just be another military setback. It would discredit the entire concept of long-range penetration operations, potentially for decades. It would confirm the skeptics who argued that unconventional warfare was a distraction from conventional operations. It would end Wingate's career definitively, and possibly vindicate those who'd wanted to invalid him out of the army after his suicide attempt. But Wingate believed the gamble was worth taking because the alternative, accepting strategic paralysis and Japanese control of Burma, was worse. In June 1942, Wingate gathered his officers at the training area in Saugor, Central Provinces, and delivered a speech that survivors remembered decades later. He didn't minimize the challenges. He didn't promise that everything would work perfectly. Instead, he explained his philosophy of jungle warfare and what would be required to implement it. The speech covered several key points. First, abandon defensive thinking. The jungle is neutral, Wingate said. It provides concealment to both sides equally, but we will use it offensively, while the enemy uses it defensively. This gives us the advantage. Second, embrace movement as survival. A moving target is hard to hit. A force that never stays in the same place cannot be surrounded. We will march at night and hide during the day. We will attack unexpectedly and disappear before the enemy can respond. Third, trust aerial resupply. You must have absolute confidence that supply drops will come. Everything depends on this. Without supply drops, we cannot survive. With them, we can operate indefinitely behind enemy lines. Fourth, accept calculated risk. Some of you will be wounded or become sick. We cannot evacuate everyone. We will do what we can, but you must understand that if you cannot march, you may be left behind with local villagers or in a position where you have a chance of evasion. This is the price of deep penetration operations. Fifth, maintain aggression. We will always attack when we have surprise. We will never defend when we can withdraw. The enemy expects us to be cautious because we are behind their lines. We will be aggressive precisely because we are behind their lines. The officers listened, many skeptical but willing to try. The soldiers, when briefed, reacted with a mixture of fear and excitement. What Wingate was proposing sounded insane. Deliberately going deep behind Japanese lines, relying on supply drops, accepting that casualties might not be evacuated. But it also sounded like finally doing something rather than preparing to defend against the next Japanese offensive. Training began immediately and was unlike anything British forces had experienced. Physical conditioning came first. Wingate established a baseline. Every soldier must be able to march 20 miles per day carrying 60-pound packs through jungle terrain. This was roughly double what standard infantry doctrine assumed. Soldiers marched, then marched more, then marched until they could maintain pace for days. Units that couldn't keep up were replaced. Navigation training was relentless. British forces had failed in Burma partly because they couldn't navigate off roads. Wingate's troops learned to navigate by compass at night, moving through jungles so thick they couldn't see more than a few feet. They learned to cross rivers silently. They learned to bivouac without light or noise. They learned to recognize landmarks in featureless jungle. Tactical training emphasized ambush and withdrawal. Never stand and fight unless you must. Always seek surprise. Always have an escape route. Attack supply columns, not frontline units. Target communications, not defensive positions. Win through disruption, not destruction. Radio training was exhaustive. Every column would operate independently, coordinating only through radio. Operators needed to maintain contact across hundreds of miles through jungle canopy and hills that blocked signals. They practiced encryption, scheduled contacts, emergency procedures. The entire operation would fail if radio communication failed. Supply drop training required learning an entirely new skill, marking drop zones, guiding aircraft, recovering supplies, moving away before enemy forces could respond. This had never been done at scale in jungle warfare. Wingate's troops practiced it until it became routine. The training was deliberately harsh. Wingate believed that soldiers needed to discover their own capabilities through adversity. He pushed units beyond what they thought possible, then pushed further. Some soldiers broke under the strain. Some units failed to meet standards and were replaced. But those who survived the training program developed extraordinary confidence, not just in their abilities, but in Wingate's methods. By December 1942, after 6 months of training, the Chindits numbered approximately 3,000 men organized into 7 columns, each roughly 400 strong. They could march 20-30 miles per day through jungle. They could navigate at night. They could survive on supply drops. They could execute ambushes and withdraw under pressure. They were, by any measure, the most highly trained force for jungle operations in the British Army. But training is not combat. Everything Wingate had built, the tactics, the doctrine, the confidence, would mean nothing if it didn't work in actual operations. In February 1943, Wavell approved Operation Longcloth, the first long-range penetration operation into Burma. The objective was to cross the Chindwin River, penetrate deep into Burma, cut the Mandalay-Myitkyina Railway, a crucial Japanese supply line, and demonstrate that British forces could operate successfully behind Japanese lines. Wingate faced one final moment of doubt. Everything he'd argued for 6 months, that aerial resupply worked, that mobility trumped firepower, that offense was safer than defense, that average soldiers could become exceptional through training, was about to be tested in the most unforgiving environment imaginable. On February 8, 1943, Wingate's columns began crossing the Chindits River into Japanese-held Burma. Each soldier carried supplies for 1 week. After that, they would depend entirely on aerial resupply. If the supply drops failed, 3,000 men would be stranded hundreds of miles behind enemy lines with no way home. The time had come. The crossing of the Chindits River began at dusk on February 8, 1943, and immediately revealed the gap between training and reality. On paper, the crossing was straightforward. 7 columns would cross at different points along a 50-mile stretch of river, then converge on routes leading toward the railway targets deep in Burma. In practice, crossing a major river at night with mules, radios, and 3,000 men while maintaining secrecy was chaos barely controlled by rigid discipline. Wingate crossed with the headquarters column near Tonhe. He watched as soldiers waded into the Chindits, weapons held high, supplies balanced on their heads or loaded onto makeshift rafts. The river was about 200 yards wide at this point, flowing swift and cold. Soldiers who lost their footing were swept downstream, recovered by others waiting below the crossing point. Mules, terrified of the water, had to be coaxed and sometimes dragged across. One radio set was dropped and lost in the dark water, a disaster that reduced the column's communication capability by 1/3. The crossing took 6 hours. By dawn, all columns were across and melting into the jungle on the eastern bank. Behind them lay India and safety. Ahead lay 200 miles of enemy-controlled territory, Japanese garrisons, and the most sustained test of Wingate's theories that anyone had yet attempted. The first week of the operation was a revelation, but not entirely in the way Wingate had anticipated. Movement through the jungle was simultaneously easier and harder than training had suggested. Easier because Japanese forces were concentrated along roads and railways, leaving vast areas undefended. Harder because the jungle itself was more difficult than any training ground. Teak forests with thick undergrowth where visibility dropped to a few yards. River valleys where every stream had to be forded. Hills so steep that mules had to be hauled up slopes with ropes. But the columns moved, maintaining a pace of 15-20 miles per day, navigating by compass, avoiding all contact with civilians and Japanese forces. Wingate's plan called for radio silence until the first supply drop. He didn't want Japanese radio intelligence to locate his columns prematurely. On February 16th, 8 days after crossing the Chindits, the first supply drop was scheduled. This was the critical test. If aerial resupply failed, the entire operation would have to be aborted. The columns had approximately 3 days of supplies remaining. After that, they would be forced to either return to India or try living off the land. Neither option acceptable. Wingate's headquarters column established a drop zone in a clearing east of the Chindits. At the scheduled time, RAF Dakotas appeared, flying low over the jungle. Soldiers marked the drop zone with colored panels and smoke. The aircraft made their passes, and supplies tumbled from cargo doors. Sacks of rice, ammunition boxes, radio batteries, medical supplies, each load attached to parachutes color-coded to identify contents. The drop was imperfect. Some supplies landed in trees and couldn't be recovered. Some parachutes failed to open, and supplies hit the ground at terminal velocity, shattering. Some loads drifted off target and fell into jungle too thick to search. But enough supplies landed accurately that the column could restock. More importantly, the psychological effect was enormous. Soldiers who had harbored secret doubts about whether aerial resupply would really work saw it demonstrated. The Chindits were not, after all, abandoned deep in enemy territory. The RAF would come. Over the next 10 days, the columns pushed deeper into Burma, converging on the Mandalay-Mitkaina Railway, according to Wingate's plan. The operation was entering its crucial phase, the actual attacks on Japanese supply lines that were the operation's primary objective. On February 24th, 2 columns, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel L.A. Alexander and Major Michael Calvert reached the railway near Kiaik Thin. What they found was simultaneously encouraging and concerning. Encouraging because the railway was lightly defended. Japanese forces in Burma numbered roughly 80,000, but they were concentrated in front-line areas facing India or engaged in operations in eastern Burma against Chinese forces. Rear areas were garrisoned by small units focused on protecting key facilities, not patrolling vast stretches of jungle. Concerning because destroying a railway required more than just cutting tracks. The railway had to be damaged severely enough that repairs would take days or weeks, not hours. Cutting tracks was easy. Japanese engineers could repair simple track damage in a few hours. Destroying bridges, culverts, or stations required demolitions and time that exposed the Chindits to counterattack. Calvert, an expert in demolitions, had brought enough explosives to do the job properly. His column spent February 25th placing charges on a railway bridge and a section of track, then detonated them at dusk. The bridge collapsed spectacularly. Rails were blown into twisted metal. Culverts were destroyed. The damage would take at least a week to repair, during which Japanese trains couldn't use this section of railway. The explosion announced the Chindits' presence. Within hours, Japanese commanders knew that British forces were operating behind their lines. The question was, how many British forces, where were they, and what should be done about them? Wingate, monitoring reports from all columns, faced the first major decision of the operation. The original plan called for columns to attack the railway, then withdraw back to India. Mission accomplished, risk minimized. But Wingate had begun to realize something important. The Japanese response was confused and disorganized. They didn't know how many Chindits there were. They didn't know the objectives. They were responding to each attack locally rather than coordinating a theater-wide response. This created an opportunity. If the Chindits remained behind Japanese lines, continuing to attack targets, they would force Japanese commanders to allocate troops to rear area security, troops that couldn't be used on frontline operations. The psychological effect would be devastating, proving that Japanese rear areas weren't secure, that British forces could operate aggressively in jungle terrain. But remaining behind Japanese lines meant increasing risk exponentially. Every day increased the chance of casualties from combat or disease. Every day increased the chance that Japanese forces would locate and ambush a column. Every day was another supply drop that might fail. Another night march through unknown terrain, another test of whether Wingate's theories would hold under prolonged stress. On February 27th, Wingate made his decision. The columns would continue operations, crossing the Irrawaddy River, much larger than the Chindwin, and attacking targets even deeper in Burma. This wasn't in the original plan. Wavell had authorized operations up to the Irrawaddy, but not beyond. Wingate was extending the operation on his own authority, gambling that success would justify the risk. Here's where Wingate's leadership style became crucial. Lesser commanders might have hidden this decision, fearing subordinates would question or resist orders that exceeded the original plan. Wingate was direct. He radioed all column commanders explaining the decision and why he believed continued operations were essential. He acknowledged the increased risk. He also made clear that this was an order, not a suggestion. The responses varied. Some commanders, particularly Calvert, were enthusiastic, believing the operation was achieving important effects. Others were concerned about supply situation, mounting casualties from minor combat and disease, and the psychological strain on troops who'd been behind enemy lines for 3 weeks. But all complied. Between March 1st and March 10th, 4 columns crossed the Irrawaddy River and pushed into Burma's interior. The other 3 columns, experiencing equipment failures and mounting casualties, were ordered to return to India. This was another hard decision. Splitting the force reduced its strength, but also reduced the logistical burden on supply aircraft and allowed damaged columns to withdraw before they became unable to march. The crossing of the Irrawaddy was even more difficult than the Chindwin. The river was nearly a mile wide, flowing fast, with Japanese patrols on both banks. Columns had to build rafts from bamboo and ground sheets, ferry equipment across, swim mules through the current, all while maintaining security. The crossings took 2 nights per column. Every moment exposed them to discovery. Calvert's column crossed near Iniwa on March 6th. They were spotted by Japanese patrol on the east bank, triggering a firefight that killed several Chindits and alerted Japanese forces to the crossing site. Calvert had no choice but to push forward, moving fast to escape before Japanese reinforcements arrived. For the next 48 hours, his column marched nearly continuously, putting distance between themselves and pursuing Japanese forces. This was the pattern that would characterize the next month. Attack, move, always staying ahead of Japanese responses. The Chindits cut the railway in multiple locations. They attacked supply dumps, burned fuel stores, ambushed road convoys. They forced Japanese commanders to allocate troops to protect rear areas. They demonstrated undeniably that British forces could operate successfully deep in Burma. But they were also beginning to fray. Supplies were tight. Some supply drops failed when aircraft couldn't locate drop zones. Soldiers were living on reduced rations. Malaria was spreading. By mid-March, perhaps 20% of Chindit's strength was sick, many seriously. Wounded soldiers who couldn't march were being left with Burmese villagers, with morphine and prayers. The strain of constant movement, minimal sleep, and perpetual danger was wearing on everyone. And the Japanese were adapting. Initial responses had been confused and local. By mid-March, Japanese commanders had concentrated forces along likely Chindit routes and were conducting aggressive patrols. Several columns had close encounters with Japanese units, resulting in firefights that inflicted casualties the Chindits could barely afford. On March 24th, Wingate made the hardest decision of the operation: order withdrawal. The Chindits had been behind Japanese lines for 6 weeks. They'd achieved their objectives, cutting the railway multiple times, destroying supplies, demonstrating capability, but they were reaching the limit of endurance. Disease was spreading, ammunition was low, Japanese forces were closing in. The withdrawal would not be a simple march back to India. The columns were scattered across Burma, some more than 300 miles from safety. Japanese forces now knew roughly where they were and could concentrate to block withdrawal routes. And the monsoon was approaching. Within weeks, rivers would flood, making crossings impossible. Wingate ordered columns to withdraw independently, taking different routes to divide Japanese attention. He couldn't coordinate a mass withdrawal. Radio communication was degrading as batteries died and equipment failed. Each column commander would have to navigate their own path to India. This was where the operation became a test of pure endurance and will. The withdrawal from Burma in late March and April 1943 was not a retreat. It was survival. What had been a coordinated military operation became 7 separate odysseys of exhausted soldiers trying to reach safety across hundreds of miles of enemy territory. Calvert's column, still relatively intact with about 300 men, withdrew north toward the Chinese border before turning west toward India. Their route took them through some of Burma's most difficult terrain, jungle-covered mountains where trails were barely visible, where every mile had to be measured against remaining strength and dwindling supplies. On March 28th, 3 days into the withdrawal, Calvert's column encountered a Japanese blocking force near Bo. The Japanese had positioned troops across likely withdrawal routes, hoping to ambush returning Chindit columns. Calvert had 2 options: fight through or detour. Detouring would add days to the march and exhaust soldiers already near their limit. Fighting through risked casualties and would reveal the column's position to other Japanese forces. Calvert chose to fight. His column attacked at dawn, using the aggressive tactics Wingate had drilled into them. Quick assault, inflict casualties, withdraw before the enemy could coordinate response. The firefight lasted less than an hour. The Chindits killed approximately 30 Japanese soldiers and broke through the blocking position, but lost 15 killed and 23 wounded. This was where the operation's harshest reality became inescapable. Calvert couldn't carry seriously wounded soldiers. He couldn't evacuate them. There were no helicopters, no supply drops in Japanese-controlled territory during withdrawal. His only option was to leave the wounded with Burmese villagers, providing morphine and written notes explaining they were prisoners who should be treated according to Geneva Convention. Some of these wounded soldiers survived to be captured by Japanese forces. Many did not. This was the price Wingate had warned about, the price every Chindit had accepted when joining the operation, but accepting it theoretically and experiencing it directly were different things. Calvert's men marched on, haunted by the knowledge that they'd left comrades behind. Other columns faced worse situations. Lieutenant Colonel S.A. Cook's column was intercepted by Japanese forces near the Irrawaddy and had to scatter into small groups to escape. Major Kenneth Gilkes's column ran into a Japanese patrol that destroyed their radio and killed several officers. Without radio communication, Gilkes couldn't request supply drops or coordinate with other columns. His soldiers were on their own. The most devastating situation faced Wingate's own headquarters column. On March 29th, while attempting to cross the Irrawaddy back to the west, the column was ambushed by Japanese forces. In the chaos of the firefight and withdrawal, the column fragmented. Wingate found himself with only about 40 soldiers, separated from the main body of his force. For the next 2 weeks, Wingate's small group marched west, living off the land, avoiding Japanese patrols, making for the Chindwin River and India beyond. This was the ultimate test of everything Wingate had theorized. He was now experiencing exactly what his soldiers experienced, with no special privileges, no headquarters staff, no command authority, except what his companions granted him. They marched at night, hiding during the day in jungles so thick that even aggressive Japanese patrols passed within meters without detecting them. They ate what they could forage, bamboo shoots, wild fruit, occasionally, trading with Burmese villagers for rice. They crossed rivers by swimming, their few remaining supplies held above water in improvised rafts. They lost track of time, measuring progress only by the westward movement toward the Chindwin. On April 14th, nearly 7 weeks after entering Burma, Wingate's group reached the Chindwin and crossed into India. Wingate himself had lost nearly 30 pounds. He was suffering from malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion. Several of the soldiers with him were delirious from fever, but they'd made it. Across April and May, other Chindit columns straggled back into India by various routes. Some columns remained relatively intact, arriving with 70–80% of their original strength. Others had disintegrated into small groups, men arriving individually or in 2s and 3s, having survived through luck as much as skill. The final accounting was brutal. Of approximately 3,000 men who crossed the Chindwin in February, about 200 returned to India. The remaining 800 were killed, captured, or died of disease and exhaustion during the withdrawal. Of those who returned, more than half required immediate hospitalization for malaria, dysentery, wounds, or simple exhaustion. Many would never be fit for combat again. By conventional military standards, these were devastating losses. An operation that resulted in 800 casualties and rendered another 1,000+ soldiers unfit for service was, by any measure, expensive. Commanders who lost a third of their force typically faced courts-martial, not congratulations. But by the standards of what the operation had achieved and what it represented, the casualties had purchased something valuable. The Chindits had operated behind Japanese lines for 3 months. They had cut the Mandalay-Mitkaina railway in at least 75 places. They had destroyed bridges, supply dumps, and communications facilities. They had killed hundreds of Japanese soldiers and forced Japanese commanders to allocate thousands more to rear area security, troops that couldn't be used on front-line operations. They had marched more than 1,000 miles through jungle terrain, demonstrating conclusively that British forces could operate in an environment that supposedly favored Japanese tactics. Most importantly, they had shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility in jungle warfare. Wingate emerged from Burma as a media sensation and a subject of intense military controversy, sometimes simultaneously in the same conversation. The media narrative was straightforward hero worship. British forces had suffered unbroken defeats in Burma for more than a year. Public morale was low. The government needed success stories, and Wingate provided one. Stories about the Chindits operating behind Japanese lines, blowing up railways, marching through jungles. This was compelling material that newspapers seized on gratefully. Churchill read the reports and was fascinated. He summoned Wingate to London in July 1943, along with Wavell, for detailed briefings. Churchill had always been attracted to unconventional operations and commanders who thought creatively. Wingate, presenting his operations and arguing passionately for expansion of long-range penetration forces, was exactly the kind of officer Churchill admired. The meeting resulted in one of the war's more remarkable promotions. Wingate, who had entered 1943 as a brigadier recovering from a suicide attempt and commanding an experimental force of 3,000 men, emerged from Churchill's office as a major general with authorization to expand Chindit operations to division-sized formations, roughly 20,000 men, for operations in 1944. But military professionals were far less enthusiastic. Critics focused on several issues. First, the casualty rate. Losing a third of your force was, by conventional standards, unsustainable. If every operation had similar casualty rates, you'd run out of soldiers quickly. Critics argued that the casualties were disproportionate to the results achieved. Railways could be repaired, supply dumps could be replaced, but trained soldiers couldn't be recovered once lost to disease and exhaustion. Second, the strategic effect was questionable. Yes, the Chindits had disrupted Japanese logistics and forced allocation of troops to rear area security. But had this actually affected Japanese frontline operations? Japanese forces had successfully defended against British offensives in the Arakan in early 1943. Japanese planning for operations against India proceeded on schedule. The Chindit operations were spectacular, but hadn't, critics argued, changed the strategic situation meaningfully. Third, resources. Long-range penetration operations required disproportionate air support. Every Dakota transport aircraft flying supply drops for Chindits was an aircraft not flying supplies over the Himalayas to China. Every elite soldier assigned to Chindit formations was a soldier not available for conventional operations. Critics argued that resources devoted to Chindit operations would achieve better results if allocated to conventional forces. Fourth, replicability. Wingate had succeeded partly through force of personality and unconventional thinking. Could his methods be replicated by conventional officers? Could they be scaled to larger formations? Critics feared that Chindit operations were dependent on Wingate himself, and that building strategy around one individual was dangerous. And fifth, medical costs. The soldiers who returned from the first Chindit operation had, on average, been reduced to physical wrecks. Malaria, dysentery, malnutrition, and exhaustion had rendered many of them unfit for further service. Some would recover, many wouldn't. Critics asked, was it ethical to conduct operations that predictably destroyed soldiers' health even when the operations succeeded? These criticisms weren't trivial. They represented genuine concerns from experienced officers who'd seen how military enthusiasm for unconventional operations could waste resources and lives without achieving proportionate results. Wingate's response to critics was characteristically blunt. He argued that conventional operations in Burma had failed repeatedly, that conventional thinking had produced nothing but defeats, and that long-range penetration operations offered the only realistic path to offensive success until Allied forces could accumulate overwhelming superiority in numbers and logistics. He also argued, correctly, that the first Chindit operation had been proof of concept, not an optimized campaign. The techniques developed could be improved, The tactics could be refined, the logistics could be streamlined. Most importantly, the psychological effect on both Allied and Japanese forces was worth the cost. This last point was difficult to quantify, but probably the most important result of the first Chindit operation. British and Indian soldiers, who'd been repeatedly beaten by Japanese forces, saw that Japanese rear areas were vulnerable, that aggressive tactics worked, that the jungle wasn't inherently hostile to Allied operations. The myth of Japanese invincibility, so psychologically damaging to Allied morale, had been punctured. Japanese commanders, conversely, had to accept that their rear areas weren't secure, that British forces could penetrate deep into Burma, and that resources would need to be allocated to rear area security. This was precisely the effect Wingate had intended, forcing enemies to defend everywhere, diluting their strength. The debate over whether the results justified the costs would continue for decades. Military historians still argue about it. What's indisputable is that Churchill sided with Wingate, and that meant the Chindits would operate again, this time on much larger scale. In late 1943, Wingate was authorized to expand Chindit forces to 6 brigades totaling approximately 23,000 men. The second Chindit operation, Operation Thursday, would launch in March 1944, using not just airdrops but combat gliders to insert forces directly into jungle airstrips behind Japanese lines. It would be even more ambitious than the first operation and even more controversial. But that second operation would occur without the man who'd invented the concept and driven its implementation. On March 24th, 1944, exactly 1 year after ordering the withdrawal from the first Chindit operation, Orde Wingate was flying in a B-25 bomber over the jungle hills of Burma when the aircraft crashed in bad weather. Everyone aboard was killed. Wingate was 41 years old. His death robbed the Allies of one of the war's most innovative military thinkers at precisely the moment when his ideas were being implemented at scale. The second Chindit operation continued under different leadership, achieved significant results, and suffered significant casualties, but without Wingate's driving personality and unconventional thinking to adapt tactics as situations developed. But the true significance of Wingate's innovations and the Chindit operations went far beyond immediate tactical results in Burma. The ripple effects would reshape military thinking about special operations, jungle warfare, and irregular operations for decades. First, and most immediately, Chindit operations demonstrated that aerial resupply could sustain military forces in terrain previously considered inaccessible to conventional operations. This sounds technical, but it was revolutionary. Before Wingate, military forces were tethered to supply lines, roads, railways, sea lanes that limited where they could operate. After Wingate demonstrated aerial resupply at scale, military planners began thinking differently about what terrain was accessible and what operations were possible. This would have profound effects. American forces in the Pacific Theater studied Chindit operations and adapted techniques for island-hopping campaigns. French forces in Indochina attempted to use aerial resupply for remote garrisons, most famously at Dien Bien Phu, where the attempt failed catastrophically, but demonstrated how completely aerial resupply had become central to military planning. By Vietnam, American forces would routinely establish fire bases supplied entirely by air, a direct descendant of techniques Wingate pioneered. Second, Chindit operations proved that long-range penetration behind enemy lines was feasible for regular military forces, not just special operations troops. This distinction mattered enormously. Special forces operate in small teams, typically a dozen soldiers or fewer. Wingate demonstrated that brigade-sized formations, thousands of soldiers, could operate behind enemy lines for months. This opened possibilities for operational planning that simply hadn't existed before. The concept of vertical envelopment, using helicopters to insert forces behind enemy lines, traces directly to Wingate's innovations. American air cavalry operations in Vietnam, helicopter assault tactics, Even modern air assault divisions owe intellectual debts to Wingate's proof that conventional forces could operate effectively deep in enemy rear areas if supplied by air. Third, the Chindits provided a model for special operations forces that would proliferate after the war. The British Special Air Service, SAS, American Special Forces, and numerous other elite units studied Chindit tactics, organization, and philosophy. The emphasis on rigorous selection, intensive training, small unit operations, and operating behind enemy lines, all hallmarks of modern special operations, were demonstrated and validated by Chindit operations. Fourth, Wingate's aggressive philosophy of jungle warfare influenced how conventional forces approached jungle operations. The British 14th Army, under General William Slim, studied Chindit operations and adapted elements of Wingate's tactics for conventional operations. The decisive British victory at Imphal, Kohima in 1944 and the subsequent reconquest of Burma employed aggressive patrolling, night operations, and acceptance of risk that owed debts to Wingate's demonstration that aggressive offense worked better than defensive caution in jungle warfare. Fifth, at a strategic level, Chindit operations demonstrated that psychological effects could be as important as physical destruction. The Chindits didn't destroy enough Japanese supplies or kill enough Japanese soldiers to matter significantly in purely physical terms. But they forced Japanese commanders to think defensively about their rear areas, allocate resources to security operations, and accept that their control of Burma was contested even hundreds of miles from front lines. This psychological effect, demonstrating that enemy rear areas are vulnerable, would become a key objective of special operations for the rest of the century. Sixth, the medical lessons from Chindit operations influenced how militaries approached tropical medicine and soldier health in extreme environments. The horrific malaria and disease rates among Chindits led to improved anti-malarial drugs, better understanding of nutritional requirements for soldiers operating in jungles, and development of medical protocols for forces operating in disease-prone environments. These medical advances saved thousands of lives in subsequent operations throughout Southeast Asia. And seventh, perhaps most abstractly but most importantly, Wingate demonstrated that military innovation doesn't require technological superiority. It requires conceptual breakthrough. The Chindits didn't have better weapons than conventional forces. They didn't have superior technology. What they had was different thinking about how to use available technology, radios, transport aircraft, to enable operations that conventional doctrine said were impossible. This lesson, that innovation comes from rethinking assumptions rather than just developing new weapons, influenced military education and doctrine development for decades. Wingate became a case study in how to challenge conventional wisdom productively, how to develop innovative tactics, and how personality and unconventional thinking could achieve results that conventional approaches couldn't. The techniques and philosophy Wingate developed can be traced through subsequent conflicts. Korea. UN forces used Chindit-style tactics for operations behind North Korean lines, including the famous Wolfhound Regiment operations. Malayan emergency. British counterinsurgency operations employed deep jungle patrols and aerial resupply techniques derived from Chindit experience. Vietnam. Both sides studied Chindit operations. American forces for helicopter assault tactics, North Vietnamese forces for operating against superior firepower through mobility and knowledge of terrain. Falklands War. British Special Forces operations in the Falklands employed long-range penetration tactics directly descended from Chindit. Doctrine. Afghanistan and Iraq. Modern Special Operations Forces conducting extended operations in hostile territory with aerial resupply are, whether they know it or not, implementing concepts Wingate pioneered in Burma. The intellectual lineage is clear, from Wingate's Chindits to SAS to American Special Forces to modern Special Operations Forces worldwide. The organizational charts have changed. The technology is incomparably better. But the fundamental concept that small, highly trained forces operating aggressively behind enemy lines can achieve effects disproportionate to their size, traces directly to what Wingate proved in Burma in 1943. So why has Orde Wingate faded from popular memory despite these significant achievements? Why do we remember Montgomery and Patton but not Wingate? Why are the Chindits largely unknown outside military history circles? There are several intersecting reasons. First, the complexity and ambiguity of Wingate's achievements make him difficult to celebrate simply. Montgomery won clear, decisive victories at El Alamein. Patton's armored advances across France were visually dramatic and strategically unambiguous. Wingate's achievements were more subtle, proving concepts, demonstrating possibilities, influencing tactics, rather than winning decisive battles. It's harder to build a heroic narrative around demonstrated that aerial resupply enables long-range penetration operations than around defeated Rommel at El Alamein. Second, Wingate died before the war ended. Montgomery and Patton survived to write memoirs, give interviews, and shape their own legacies. Wingate died in 1944, meaning he never had opportunity to defend his reputation or explain his achievements to post-war audiences. His story was told by others, some admirers, some critics, but never by Wingate himself with the forceful personality that had characterized his life. Third, Chindit operations were overshadowed by subsequent campaigns. The decisive British victories in Burma came in 1944-45 through conventional operations by the 14th Army under Slim. These campaigns reconquered Burma, defeated Japanese forces decisively, and are rightly celebrated. But they overshadowed earlier Chindit operations, making the Chindits seem like an interesting sideshow rather than a crucial step in developing the tactics that enabled those later victories. Fourth, the controversy over Chindit casualties and effectiveness never fully resolved. Military historians still debate whether the results justified the costs. This ongoing controversy makes Wingate a complicated figure, neither pure hero nor obvious villain, but something ambiguous. Popular memory prefers clearer narratives. Fifth, Wingate's personality and reputation worked against his popular legacy. He was notoriously difficult, abrasive, contemptuous of conventional officers, and had attempted suicide in 1941. These biographical facts complicate the hero narrative. It's easier to celebrate generals who were team players and mentally stable than to celebrate someone as iconoclastic and troubled as Wingate. Sixth, the Burma campaign generally receives less attention than European or Pacific theaters in popular histories of World War II. When Burma is discussed, it's usually through the lens of the decisive 1944-45 campaigns, not the earlier Chindit operations. Geographic and cultural distance from Western audiences means Burma is simply less familiar than France or the Philippines. Seventh, the specialized nature of Wingate's contributions means they're most appreciated by military professionals rather than general audiences. Understanding why long-range penetration operations mattered requires understanding military doctrine, logistics, and operational concepts, all topics that don't translate well to popular narrative. It's much easier to understand defeated enemy army than demonstrated that aerial resupply enables operational independence. And eighth, Wingate had no natural constituency to keep his memory alive. He wasn't from a famous military family. He had no political connections. He'd alienated much of the military establishment. After his death, there was no powerful group with interest in preserving and promoting his legacy. The Chindits themselves were disbanded after the war, scattered across civilian life, without the organizational continuity that might have preserved their commander's reputation. Despite these factors, military historians have never forgotten Wingate. Professional military education continues to study Chindit operations as case studies in innovation, special operations, and unconventional thinking. Modern special forces trace intellectual lineage to Wingate's concepts. His influence on military doctrine is secure among those who study such things. But popular memory has indeed largely forgotten him, a striking contrast to the impact his innovations had on military practice. In the end, Orde Wingate deserves to be remembered not primarily for what his forces destroyed or how many enemy soldiers they killed, but for what he proved was possible and how that proof changed military thinking. Remember the day in March 1943 when a British brigadier stood in the Burmese jungle 200 miles behind enemy lines and demonstrated that everything the experts said was impossible was, in fact, achievable. Remember the courage of 3,000 soldiers who marched into enemy territory knowing they couldn't be evacuated if wounded, knowing supply lines didn't exist, knowing that conventional wisdom said they'd be destroyed, and who proved conventional wisdom wrong. Remember that sometimes at critical moments, individual actions matter enormously. One man, difficult, troubled, brilliant, convinced the British military establishment to try something radically new. His success didn't win the war in Burma by itself, but it broke the psychological paralysis that had gripped Allied forces after unbroken defeats. It demonstrated that Japanese forces could be beaten in jungle warfare through aggressive action rather than defensive grinding. And it pioneered techniques that would influence military operations for generations. The irony is that Wingate probably would have been irritated by being remembered as a hero. He didn't care about glory. He cared about proving his ideas worked. He didn't want monuments. He wanted the military establishment to accept that conventional doctrine was often wrong and that rigorous analysis plus innovative thinking could identify better approaches. In that sense, the fact that his specific techniques and tactics have been absorbed into standard military practice is perhaps the best memorial. Every time Special Forces plan a long-range penetration operation, every time commanders consider aerial resupply to enable operational independence, every time military planners accept that aggressive offense can work better than defensive caution in difficult terrain, they're implementing concepts Wingate fought to prove. The Chindits were unusual, perhaps unique, in demonstrating that failure, the Burma debacle of 1942, could be transformed into innovation if someone was willing to think rigorously about what went wrong and how to do better. Most armies respond to defeat by doing the same things harder. More troops, more firepower, more of whatever didn't work the first time. Wingate responded by rejecting conventional assumptions and building something completely new. That intellectual courage, the willingness to say, the experts are wrong, and I can prove it, is rare in any field, but especially rare in military organizations where unconventional thinking can get people killed. Wingate possessed it absolutely. He was right often enough that his innovations mattered. He was wrong sometimes. The controversy over Chindit casualties reflects real costs of his approach. But he changed how armies think about what's possible, and that matters more than most battlefield victories. On March 24, 1944, when Wingate's plane crashed in the Burmese hills, the Allied military lost one of its most innovative thinkers at precisely the moment when his ideas were being implemented at scale. We can't know what he might have achieved had he survived the war. We can't know how he might have adapted his thinking to post-war conflicts or influenced military doctrine development in the 1950s and beyond. What we know is what he achieved in the brief time he had. He invented modern jungle warfare. He pioneered long-range penetration operations. He demonstrated that aerial resupply could enable operational independence. He proved that aggressive action by elite forces could achieve effects disproportionate to their size. And he broke the myth of Japanese invincibility in jungle terrain, giving Allied forces the psychological confidence to win campaigns that had seemed impossible. This is our history, and it's worth remembering. Not just for what Wingate and the Chindits did, but for what they proved about innovation, courage, and the possibilities that emerge when someone refuses to accept that impossible means shouldn't be attempted. The general who stood in the Burmese jungle in March 1943, commanding troops 200 miles behind enemy lines with nothing but aerial resupply and audacious tactics, changed warfare forever. That achievement deserves to be remembered alongside the more famous victories that overshadow it. Remember Orde Wingate. Remember the Chindits. Remember that sometimes the most important innovations come not from superior technology, but from superior thinking about how to use what you have. And remember that the experts are sometimes catastrophically wrong, and that proving them wrong matters more than avoiding controversy.